this begins with strength, and honestly, that is such an important first card for this story because it immediately tells me that symbolically, this connection is not remembered as something casual. From their perspective, you represent the person who made them feel something powerful enough that they had to contain it, control it, almost wrestle with it internally. Okay? And that is where their version of this love story already starts to become very different from what you may have assumed. They may have looked calm. They may have acted normal. For some of you, they may even have seemed strangely composed when you expected more emotion. But strength is not absence of feeling. It is feeling something intensely and trying not to let that intensity control you. So if they could explain the beginning of this story, I think they would say, "You affected me before I knew what to call it. There was something about your presence that felt steady. Not loud, not forced, not performative. They noticed how you handled yourself. They noticed that you could be warm without chasing, caring without losing yourself, strong without needing to prove that you were strong." And listen, that combinations stayed with them. But here is the part I want you to remember, because we are going to come back to this later. Strength can also symbolize restraint. Someone can want to move closer while simultaneously telling themselves, "Slow down. Don't reveal too much. Don't get carried away." That is where the tension begins. The attraction was there, yes, but underneath it was respect. Then, underneath the respect came attachment. And underneath that attachment came a question they may not have expected to ask themselves at all. Why can I suddenly picture this person remaining in my life? Not marriage yet. Not the huge future reveal yet. We are not there. But the seed was planted. And what makes this interesting is that the next card may show us what happened once keeping those emotions under control stopped feeling so easy, because that is where their inner conflict truly begins. And I think the conflict was that for a while, they genuinely believed they could manage this. They could keep it in its place. They could enjoy talking to you, enjoy being around you, feel whatever they were feeling, and still somehow keep a firm grip on themselves. But eventually, that grip started to loosen. And that is important. Because when somebody is trying this hard to contain an emotion, sometimes the first sign that it is becoming significant is not what they do around you. It is what happens after you are gone. They replay the conversation. They wonder why one little thing you said is still sitting in their mind hours later. They think about whether you notice something in their expression. They start questioning whether they said too much or maybe not enough. And for some of you, there may have been moments when your absence suddenly felt more noticeable than your presence had before. Okay? That is where this starts becoming difficult to dismiss, because now it is not simply, "I'm attracted to this person." It becomes, "Why am I still thinking about them? Why do I care what they thought of that conversation? Why am I suddenly so aware of myself when they are around?" And listen, I do not think that necessarily means they understood what was happening right away. If anything, they may have tried even harder to act normal because they could feel that something inside them was becoming less controlled. The tighter they tried to hold the feeling in one place, the more obvious it became to them that it was spreading into other parts of their emotional world. That is the real conflict. Not, "Do I like you?" I think symbolically, they were moving beyond that question. The harder question was becoming, what happens if I admit that this person is starting to matter to me? Because admitting that changes things. Suddenly, there is vulnerability. Suddenly, your opinion carries weight. Your presence carries weight. Even the possibility of you pulling away carries weight. And this is where their version of the story may surprise you. Because there are moments between the two of you that you may remember as completely ordinary. But I am not convinced they remember them that way at all. Because some of those moments may have become important to them later, not necessarily while they were happening. And I think that distinction matters. Maybe there was a conversation that went on longer than either of you intended. Maybe you made them laugh at a moment when they were expecting to stay guarded. Maybe there was a look, a pause, something you remembered for 5 minutes and then moved on from. But they didn't. Or at least symbolically, this suggests that certain moments gained meaning after the fact. Because sometimes you do not realize that someone has become emotionally significant while you are sitting across from them. You realize it later when something reminds you of them and your mind immediately goes back there. You remember how easy the conversation felt. You remember how they looked at you. You remember that you felt understood without having to explain everything. And suddenly, this person is connected to a feeling you did not know you were looking for. That is where I think you became more than simply someone they were attracted to. You became a reference point. Okay? So now, when they experience connection elsewhere, there may be this quiet comparison happening underneath it. Not necessarily is this person better or worse than you. It can be much subtler than that. Does this feel as natural? Do I feel as comfortable? Do I want to keep talking? Do I feel that same pull to stay a little longer? And listen, that is how seemingly ordinary memories can become very difficult to replace. There may even have been moments when the energy between you felt unexpectedly alive, where they wanted to move closer, say something more direct, or simply follow the feeling instead of analyzing it. But then they pulled themselves back. And you may have interpreted that as inconsistency. You may have thought, well, if that moment mattered, why didn't they do anything with it? That is a fair question. Because from your side, meaning is usually measured by what someone shows you. But from their side, some of the strongest moments in this story may be the exact moments they tried hardest to make look ordinary. And that brings us to something much deeper. Because if they were protecting themselves this much, the question is no longer whether they felt something. The question becomes, what did they believe they were risking if they let themselves feel more? And I think what they were risking, at least emotionally, was losing the ability to tell themselves that this was temporary. Because casual attraction is easier in one very specific way. It does not ask you to reorganize anything. You can enjoy it, you can feel it, you can even get excited about it and still tell yourself, this is just a moment. I know what this is. But you were becoming harder to put into that category. And listen, that may actually explain some of the hesitation. The stronger the connection became, the more consequences appeared around it. What if this becomes serious? What if I let this person see me differently? What if I cannot control where this goes? What if I get attached and then lose it? Those are very different questions from simply wondering whether somebody likes you back. Okay? And symbolically, there is something here about circumstances beginning to feel less predictable. Almost like they had a version of themselves who knew how relationships were supposed to go, knew how much emotion they were comfortable showing, knew when to move forward and when to step away. And then you came into the picture. Suddenly that system did not work quite as neatly because you were not fitting into the temporary position they may have expected you to occupy. That is where caution can actually increase, not because the feeling is getting weaker, because it is becoming harder to control the outcome. And I want to be careful here because fear does not automatically excuse somebody for being inconsistent, distant, or unclear. You still experience their behavior from your side. But when we are trying to understand their version of the story, the emotional logic may have been very different. They may have thought restraint was protecting them, protecting their independence, protecting their expectations, protecting the parts of themselves they were not ready to expose. But eventually, I think the restraint itself started revealing something. Why would they need this much control if nothing important was happening? And that is where the question begins to change. It stops being, how do I keep this feeling contained? And slowly becomes something much more unsettling. Why am I thinking about where this could go? Why am I wondering whether this person would actually fit into my life? And maybe most importantly, why can I suddenly imagine them still being here later? And I think that is where this starts becoming less about fantasy and more about placement. Where do you fit? Not in some dramatic, unrealistic picture. I mean, in the ordinary parts of life. Would you be there for the celebrations? Would they want your opinion before making an important decision? Would they naturally start thinking about what you would like, how you would feel, whether you would be comfortable around the people closest to them? Because that is often how the future shows up before someone is ready to call it a future. It is subtle. You are not necessarily imagining a wedding. You are imagining a Saturday. You are imagining bringing this person somewhere with you. You are imagining what it would be like if seeing them became normal instead of occasional. And listen, that difference matters because wanting somebody intensely is one thing. Seeing them fitting into your actual life is something else. That is where the seed we talked about earlier starts becoming a picture. Maybe they began thinking about routines. Maybe there was this quiet sense of, I could get used to this. Your presence, your energy, the way you carry yourself, the way you make things feel a little calmer without becoming boring. For some of you, I think that was especially significant because there is something here about independence too, about having a life, having your own standards, your own rhythm, your own sense of self. And strangely enough, that may be part of why they could picture you staying. You did not necessarily feel like someone who would consume their entire world. You may have felt like someone who could stand beside them inside it. Okay? That is a very different kind of attraction. It is not only, I want this person. It starts becoming, I think my life could actually make room for this person. And maybe even, I think my life would feel different if they were part of it. That is where belonging enters the story. Not possession, not dependence, belonging, the feeling that someone could become familiar without becoming ordinary. That closeness could feel peaceful instead of restrictive. And once that thought enters somebody's mind, it becomes difficult to keep the connection in the category of temporary. Because then the questions get bigger. Not just, will you still be here? But what would it actually mean if you were? And I think what it could mean is that they stopped asking only whether they enjoyed having you in their life and started asking whether they could actually build something with you. That is a much bigger question. Because now you are not talking about chemistry for a few weeks or even a connection that feels good when everything is easy. You are talking about, could we survive real life together? Could we disagree and still find our way back? Could I trust this person with the parts of my life that are not polished? Could we make decisions together without one person disappearing into the other? And listen, those questions usually do not appear when someone thinks you are temporary. For some of you, I think they may have started looking at qualities in you that were never the loudest part of the attraction, but became much more important once they pictured something lasting. Your steadiness, the fact that you can care without chasing, the way you can be present without forcing closeness, your ability to have your own life and still make someone feel included in it. Those qualities begin to matter differently when somebody starts wondering, could this actually work long term? Okay? And yes, symbolically, this is where thoughts of serious commitment can enter. A shared home, marriage, family, building routines together, being beside each other through years instead of moments. I am not saying that guarantees any specific outcome. But I do think their internal version of this story may have traveled much further than what they ever showed you. That is the surprising part. They may have been outwardly cautious while privately considering compatibility. Not just, do I want you? But, can I trust you? Can we grow together? Could I still choose this when life is not exciting? And there is also something here about realizing what may have been overlooked, because once somebody seriously imagines a future with you, they can suddenly look at what is happening in the present and think, wait, have I been so focused on protecting myself that I failed to recognize what was actually being offered to me? That changes the emotional weight of everything. The distance, the hesitation, the opportunities they did not take. Because restraint looks very different when you realize the thing you were protecting yourself from losing might be the same thing your restraint could cause you to lose. And I think that is exactly where they begin looking backward. And looking backward may be where the story becomes uncomfortable for them. Because now certain choices do not look the same. A conversation they avoided may suddenly feel like a conversation they should have had. A moment when they could have been more open may start replaying differently. Even a period of distance that once felt completely reasonable to them may now raise a different question. Why did I do that? Not necessarily because they had no reason. They probably did. Maybe they were overwhelmed. Maybe they were protecting themselves. Maybe they were trying to keep the connection from becoming bigger than they felt prepared to handle. But there is a difference between having reasons and being satisfied with the result, okay? And I think that is what they may be confronting now. I had my reasons for holding back. Yes, but what did those reasons cost me? That question is much harder. Because once they started picturing you as someone who could actually remain in their life, the possibility of you not being there became more real too. And listen, sometimes absence clarifies something that presence could not. When somebody is available to you, emotionally or otherwise, there can be this unconscious assumption that there will always be another conversation, another opportunity, another moment to say what you almost said. But what happens when they start considering that maybe there will not be? What happens when they imagine you moving forward without waiting for them to figure themselves out? That can change the meaning of the past very quickly. Now, the silence feels louder. The hesitation feels more consequential. The moments when they acted like they cared less than they did suddenly do not feel protective anymore. They feel expensive. And I do not mean this as punishment or some dramatic regret story. I mean clarity. They may finally be able to see that protecting themselves from vulnerability also protected them from experiencing the connection fully. And that is where their version of this love story begins asking something of them. Because recognizing your importance privately is one thing. Thinking about the future is one thing. Looking back and understanding what fear may have interrupted is one thing. But none of that answers the most important question. If they know what this connection means now, are they willing to stop protecting themselves long enough to actually choose it? And I think choosing it would require a completely different kind of strength from the one we started with. Because in the beginning, strength looked like control. Hold it in, stay composed, do not reveal too much. But now, strength may look like being honest enough to let somebody see that they mattered. And that is much harder. Because feeling something privately gives you control over the story. Imagining a future privately still allows you to stay protected. You can think about someone, miss them, picture what could happen, and never have to risk hearing an answer you do not want. Choosing is different. Choosing requires movement. It requires saying something clearly enough that the other person does not have to guess anymore. It may require admitting, I cared before I was ready to admit that I cared. Or, I know I made this more confusing than it needed to be. Okay? And there is something else here. Their version of falling for you may not contain one huge moment where everything suddenly changed. It may have happened in pieces. One conversation where you mattered more than expected. One absence that felt too noticeable. One moment of imagining you in their future. One realization that they had started protecting themselves from losing something they had never fully allowed themselves to have. That adds up. And eventually there comes a point where thinking faster, analyzing harder, or trying to stay one step ahead of the feeling does not solve anything. In fact, it can create more confusion. They may have spent so much time trying to decide what to say, when to say it, whether to act, whether to wait, whether they were ready, that the constant mental movement became its own form of avoidance. And listen, this is where intention starts to matter more than intensity, because you can feel deeply and still behave inconsistently. You can imagine a future and still avoid the conversation that would make that future possible. So the real question is not, do they feel enough? I think we are past that. The question is, are they willing to behave differently because of what they feel? And if that internal decision has finally started changing, then the next thing we need to look at is what that shift could actually look like from your side. And from your side, I do not think that shift necessarily begins with some enormous declaration. It may be much quieter than that. They become more consistent. They stop disappearing every time the connection becomes emotionally real. They ask questions and actually stay for the answers. They remember things you told them because they are no longer trying so hard to keep you at a safe emotional distance. And listen, that matters. Because there is a difference between contacting somebody because you miss the feeling they give you and making an effort because you are starting to understand their place in your life. The second one has more intention behind it. Maybe they become less vague. Maybe they stop hiding behind casual conversation when there is clearly something deeper underneath it. Maybe they finally address something that has been sitting between the two of you instead of hoping time will make it disappear. Or maybe the first change is simply that they become more emotionally present. They listen differently. They allow the conversation to go somewhere real. They stop rushing to protect themselves the moment vulnerability appears. Okay? And symbolically, I think that is important because the energy here feels much less focused on chasing intensity and much more focused on learning how to hold emotion without running from it. That is growth, not a guarantee. Not me telling you that somebody is going to suddenly show up tomorrow with a perfect speech. But there is a psychological difference between thinking, I wish things were different, and deciding, I cannot keep treating this connection like it means nothing. That decision can happen before you see anything externally. And once it happens, their questions change again. Instead of only imagining you in their future, they may start wondering what would actually be required to build one. What needs to be said? What needs to be repaired? What would consistency look like? Would you even still be open to them? And that last question matters more than you might think, because their future vision cannot exist entirely inside their head forever. At some point, they have to recognize that you are a person with your own choices, your own boundaries, your own direction. Which brings us to the final piece of their version of this story. Because I do not think you only changed what they feel about you. I think you may have changed what they believe love is supposed to feel like. And I think what changed is that love may have stopped looking like something they needed to defend themselves against. That does not mean all of their defenses disappeared. Actually, I think some of them are still there. There is still caution. There is still that part of them that remembers what it feels like to be disappointed, exposed, or emotionally exhausted. There may still be a tendency to watch carefully before they completely let somebody in. But now they may understand something they did not understand at the beginning. You were not asking them to become weaker. You were showing them that closeness could exist without losing themselves. Okay? And that brings us all the way back to where this started. They tried to contain the feeling. Then they noticed that certain moments with you would not leave their mind. Then the connection became important enough that they started protecting themselves from it. Then somehow, without necessarily planning to, they began putting you into pictures of the future. Ordinary pictures first, then bigger ones. A shared life, long-term partnership. Maybe even marriage for some of you, symbolically. Not because I am telling you that outcome is guaranteed, but because their imagination may have gone there. And listen, that says something about the role you occupy in their version of this story. You are not only the person they wanted, you may be the person who made them reconsider what wanting someone could actually lead to. Attraction with respect, excitement without chaos, closeness without losing independence, strength with softness, and perhaps that is why they have had such a difficult time simply dismissing this connection and moving on as though it meant nothing. Because once somebody becomes connected to your idea of partnership, they are no longer just attached to a memory. They are attached to a possibility. And yes, there may still be walls around that possibility. But walls do not always mean somebody wants to stay alone. Sometimes they mean, I need to know this is safe before I finally stop standing guard. So if their version of this love story began with, you affected me before I knew what to call it, I think it may end somewhere very different. Maybe now it sounds more like, I know why I could never treat you like everyone else. Because somewhere between resisting the feeling and imagining a life where you remained, they stopped seeing you as a temporary chapter. They started wondering whether you could be part of the story they actually wanted to keep writing.